All right. So I am so excited to be here with Hope Hudson. Hope is a seasoned and engaged fundraising research and data management professional with over 15 years of experience in higher ed and nonprofit fundraising. She's also been engaged in analytics, prospect research, program creation, and program management. Hope is also my friend. So we've been having a good time already in this conversation, but really excited to have Hope here as part of the ResearchPRO latest dialogue series, Research Pride, Hidden Figures in Fundraising. And so again, Hope, welcome. Thank you for participating in this conversation series.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I really appreciate the invitation.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm looking at your bio, and it says you're currently residing in Tallahassee, but born in Colorado. I didn't realize that about you before. Raised in Iowa, but primarily raised in Ohio, and you consider yourself a Toledoan and everything that means. So my first question is, what does that mean exactly?
God help me, but it's almost like an inside joke. It's one of those things where you either have to be born and raised there or move there to get it. But in a nutshell, we like to fight.
Okay.
Yes, we like to fight, and how that actually takes shape.
Mm-hmm.
You know, is it can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. But yeah, we like to fight. We are. It's a city that Scott has a fighting spirit, like I said, for good or for bad. But yeah, I had to embrace that. Where did all this I'm not going to back down thing come from? Parents, Toledo.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm curious then. So that's a kind of a perfect segue though. This idea of fighting and standing up for yourself and standing up for the rights of yourself and others, your community, making sure that you are represented well. And so then certainly that does sort of like overlay into philanthropy and looking out for each other and looking out for your community. So I'm really curious about your introduction to the practice of philanthropy, especially coming from Toledo.
I think on a certain level, I think if you, especially if our generation, if you grew up Black, if you grew up in the traditional institutions of what make Black life, you were introduced to concept of philanthropy, whether you were aware of that or not. So the Black church and the concept of tithing. You know, many the Muslims, you know, and concepts of philanthropy. So being religious, having religious ties, you know, as institutional foundations in our community, you've been introduced to those concepts, whether you're aware of it as being philanthropy or not, almost from day one.
Yep.
Then, you know, even more so, public schools, community get-togethers, picnics, specifically for me in Toledo, where you've had an established, you know, pretty thriving, you know, Black community in Toledo, Ohio, almost as long as you've had a Toledo, Ohio. And, you know, contrary to, I think, what popular opinion has about, you know, freedom, racism, and the North and the Midwest in particular, you know, the battles we had to fight up North were the same that you saw elsewhere in the country, you know, white supremacy, access, equal pay, all of that. It didn't go away, you know, when we migrated North. In certain levels, and intensified, because even though you didn't have Jim Crow and some of the niceness, you know, with the parameters, you know, let's say associated with it, you had to fight for yours because other communities were fighting for theirs. And, you know, oftentimes, you know, you banded together, being an industrial town, and that fight, I think, kind of helps blur the lines, but nonetheless, you have philanthropy then too. The communities had to take care of themselves when strikers went on strike,
Yeah.
and so I think one of the first things, is, concepts of philanthropy, have always been, I think, part of us. We've had to take care of each other. We've had to give, we've had to share, but we just wouldn't necessarily call it that, so.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's,
Absolutely.
so I think, we breathe it because we were born with it. Simple as that. And I think that's true for us, no matter where we came from.
Absolutely. So that's your Spelman brain coming through, shining through there.
Maybe.
That answer. I love that. I love it. So then that gets me to like the next question though, is your introduction to professional fundraising, because you've worked in like a variety of shops, higher ed, social services, environment, arts and culture, maybe.
Not necessarily, but the tech. And I think the very first I guess professional introduction, if you will, was when I worked for the nonprofit CATNet, Coalition to Access Technology and Networking. And I was in the role of interim director of programming. I forgot what the title was, but needless to say, you had to raise money. And, that I would say was where I was introduced to the former of I guess the actual nuts and bolts concepts. Philanthropy is, research is, grants are, deadlines to grants are, was in that particular role, where you actually understood that there were indeed formalized processes behind, all the big gifts that, we might have seen. I think when I was at Spelman, that was when we received the big gift from Cosby, which, at the time was one of the highest that a HBCU had received. But also not knowing the work, the cultivation, the concepts that make up formalized fundraising were at play, behind that. So yeah, that I would say CATNet was my first introduction to like the bigger, more formal, professional world of prospect research, but just fundraising in general. And it's basically because I had to do it. I had to do it.
So were you responsible for fundraising there, and then you just got into prospect development from that, or?
Oh yeah. Yeah, because in a nutshell, and I know, people who know me have heard the story before, but I had to sit down and make an ask, and the donor said no, and we did the prep work, the cultivation work, all that other good stuff, and the donor said no, and I was crushed, and I didn't like that feeling. I was just like, what, didn't get it. And girl had the nerve to start crying because I was so emotional, because all the hints were there, everything that they tell you to look for, that you got the gift, were there, and the person said no. And unfortunately, I didn't have the skill set, the experience, or even like the advice about what happens after that point, what you're supposed to do after that point. Because the no didn't necessarily mean no, you can't have anything, but it was it was like no to that, and not necessarily having the awareness that there was more to come, or that there were other things that needed to be done, or other pieces of a further conversation that was needed. Girl, I started crying, embarrassed myself, embarrassed the donor. It was awful. It was absolutely awful. And I was never again, never again, ever. But I was like, but I love this research bit. I love it. This is fun.
Mhm.
This is actually fun. Why? Because I'm nosy, and this gives me an opportunity to be as nosy as I want for a good reason. So
Mhm.
yeah. And so, and also I always had a knack for it. So it's, again, when you talk about that fit. And so I left. So they hired a permanent person because the position was interim. And I was just like, and I met with a grants officer at University of Toledo, because it was a sub project of University of Toledo. Actually, I need to back up a little bit, because when I think about it, my first taste was when I was at a small nonprofit in Decatur and doing grants
Okay.
research, for them. That was not my role at all, but oftentimes in small organizations, everybody wears multiple hats. I was a program officer tasked with educating with environmental education, K through 12, and community gardening, is managing that. So it was a completely different thing, but the grants and research with the grants was fun. Didn't know it at the time, but I hooked on it. And then the cat net, and they were like, what are you going to do now? And I was like, well, that prospect research thing sounds kind of fun. And they're like, well, guess
Mhm.
what? We're about to get a permanent prospect researcher on. Let me introduce you to her. I introduced myself to her. We had a good chat, and she was like, I need help. Let's try it. And never look back, never look back. And for anybody listening, her name is Gail Hansen. I always give her props, because she is one of those unsung heroes in this industry. And
Awesome.
she is, remains a role model for me, not only in terms of how you approach prospect research, from the perspective of principles and standards, and always putting yourself in the role or in the shoes of someone. If they were to read what you write, the information
Mhm.
that you collect, how it's housed in the system, how would you feel if it was you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think that perspective also, coupled with being in the body that I'm in, as a Black woman who's also mother, because that's inescapable. Some will say, oh, I
Mhm.
separate this from this. For me, it's inescapable. It's all part of who I am. Yeah, her guidance allowed me to bring that perspective to everything that I do. And then the fight,
Awesome.
being that fighter from Toledo, Ohio, just kind of continuously driven me, to not only stand up for myself and my coworkers, my community, but also for the donor.
Yeah.
So
So you've touched on a couple of things. So first, shout out to Miss Gail Hansen,
that is her
and
name. Yes,
thank you for bringing hope to the the profession.
that's right. Thank you, Gail. I love you.
So a couple of things. You touched on like being a Black woman, and I want to get back to that because that is, and Gail also being an unsung hero. So both of those things really get to the heart of this particular dialogue series, Research Pride, Hidden
Mhm.
Figures, and Fundraising. So one of the objectives here is to show people like, hey, I'm not the only Black prospect development professional.
Mhm.
I get that a lot as a consultant in meeting people in different parts of the world.
Hmm.
And it's just always like, oh, you're the only one. Like, I have never met anyone else. You're the only one I've ever met. And it's like, no, I'm not the only one. That's number one. We're everywhere. We're
Mhm.
always everywhere. We're just overlooked,
Mhm.
um, or hidden and ignored
Mhm.
intentionally. But we're everywhere. And then two, really talking about the impact that our profession has,
Mhm.
and then tying that impact directly to us as Black women. So you and I are both Black women and identify as Black women. So that's the identity that we are centering in this conversation.
Mhm.
Um, but really, really interested in creating space to share with others that no, there are other Black people in prospect development. There are other people besides gift officers in major gift fundraising. So really, really want to talk about the impact of your work.
Okay.
And so like I think as prospect development people and researchers, we don't talk about that so much. And we easily talk about it with others. So you could tell me more about how Gail is an unsung hero, but probably less comfortable with talking about how Hope is an unsung hero. And so let's talk about your impact. I'm going to make you talk about your impact, my friend. So I'll help you. So how let's take a guess. How many billions of dollars do you think you identified in your career?
That's an interesting question. And I don't know if I can necessarily answer that. Well, you know, you said identified versus actually what they pulled in, right?
Right. So
which
on
is
average.
different. Yeah, which is actually different. And now that you mention it, I can honestly say I don't think I've actually looked at it that way.
So here's another way to look at it.
Yeah,
like think about the campaigns you worked for. You were at higher ed. You've worked for like a $50 million campaign. You've done that.
Yeah, I have. And that's again, when you talk about the identification, you know, the potential that's out there. It's different because I think then we can talk about the disparities, let's say, between HBCUs and majority institutions or cause-based nonprofits versus higher ed. You know, those that's and I did say the word disparity because I think on a certain level that there are disparities, because I guess, you know, we can look at it from the perspective that the potential is there in terms of either potential that's already in your database or potential that's newly discovered that you're trying to bring to the attention, you know, of others. So
let's talk about numbers. We're going back to numbers because we're talking about. I'm forcing my fellow prospect development professionals to, I guess, name their value, put a dollar figure on it.
I probably have identified probably about $4 billion worth of potential gifts. You know, when I think about some of the people that I have found, I've identified, brought to the attention, whether they've actually made it on a portfolio or not, whether or not the person was actually cultivated or not. Probably about $3 to $4 billion.
Yeah.
And I haven't worked for this. We're not talking about a Yale, a Harvard, you know, we're not.
Yeah.
And that, you know, I think also speaks to the potential that's out there.
It absolutely does speak to the potential that's out there. And I think that one of my many soapboxes is that as prospect development professionals, we have the ability, and fundraising professionals in general, we have an ability to prospect among the non-givers. So like only like it's less than half. It's just under 50%, or is it like 50, 52? It's either right above or right below 50%. Yeah. So let's just cut it in half. So half of the country are not giving. Half of the country is not giving, at least in ways that are being counted. And so for me, I'm like, that's an enormous prospect pool. You can't tell me that half of the country, because let's how many millions, hundreds of millions of people is that? You can't tell me that half of the United States in whole, in mass, is not philanthropic.
Right. Yeah. You were 100% correct. And I think that speaks to certain norms, I think, in terms of what we may see or consider to be potential versus the institution, the management, fellow staff might see as potential. And,
Yeah.
oftentimes I've seen or been privy to conversations, amongst ourselves as researchers about how to fill that communication gap, if you will. It's an ongoing discussion because clearly we haven't filled
Right.
it. And I'm thinking probably on a certain level, it might not necessarily be our place to fill it. And I think part of it is because no matter how you try to shake it up, in the back of the collective mind, only a certain type of donor with certain types of what's what I'm looking for, not criteria, but characteristics
Mm-hmm.
are those prospective donors.
Yeah.
So for instance, I could bring, and this is from experience, I won't name the institution, but I could bring a donor of color who has all of the check boxes:
Mm-hmm.
wealth, influence, connections, interest, to the attention. And that person, for whatever reason, will never be contacted.
Mm-hmm.
And then comes the push, if you will, or push back, of, okay, why wasn't that person contacted, or what happened?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then,
So,
yeah,
so
it's,
you and I we've both been in this game long enough to have seen a few cycles and a few patterns.
mhm,
And so certainly have been in that space of, here are some names, people of color, whether or not they're Black or Asian or Latino or mixed, some other mixed heritage,
mhm,
um, just not white. So we've experienced that where you put forth names of non-white donors, non-white prospects, and they don't get movement. They don't get movement from the organization. There's no
mhm.
engagement. And so now we're in a space where diversity, equity, and inclusion is the hot topic in philanthropy. Diversifying your prospect pool is the hottest thing, right now in prospect development. I am curious about your response to that trend. The size says it all.
And like you said, maybe it's because we've been through cycles, like we've been, we neither one of us, forgive the euphemism, are spring chicks in
Mm-hmm.
life, professional life. We and being aware of who we are from pretty early on, part of me wants to say this is just another waste of time. The curmudgeon in me wants to say this is simply lip service. Nothing will get done. if things get done, it will only be surface deep, skin deep, inch thick,
Mhm.
and little else. And it's because no matter how you look at it, money needs to be raised. And with that being the focus, that mindset, once again, about who you need to go after, how to go after them, all the cultural baggage tied to both of those things will always creep up. And oftentimes it is subconscious, I think. It's
Mhm.
done in spite of everyone's best intentions, because you have that driving factor of having to keep the bus moving and gas in the tank. That unfortunately, all that, may look good on paper, but in terms of the actual application, not only in terms of how people are treated within an organization, how you might also in terms of how you might treat your stakeholders external to the organization,
Mhm.
but also in terms of how you look at that pool of people who can actually fund what you do.
Yeah.
Forget, it doesn't matter if the person, who could fund you looks like, your clients or stakeholders, may have a little bit more, pardon the pun, skin in the game than this other donor. Nonetheless, that mindset, I think, is always going to creep into that. And once again, it brings me back to the question of, are these organizations willing to do the real hard work? And, having been on that, in organizations going through the
Mhm.
process, and I think in multiple cycles, I think the answer is no. We've had these conversations, 20 years ago.
Yep.
I remember the conversations being had in the 90s.
Yep. Yep.
And, here we are, 2022, getting ready to go into 2023. And we're still having the same conversations. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so I'm not trying to be pessimistic, because I'm also a firm believer in, people who've worked with me will tell you that I try to be engaged in the effort. But once again, what happens with that work when you do it?
Yeah, and that's the pessimism. It's hard to keep that at bay,
Mm-hmm.
um, because I absolutely recognize there are individuals of every race, ethnicity, background, culture, etc., um, that I have great relationships with within the profession of
Mm-hmm.
fundraising, and those people are awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Um, at the same time, somehow the racism of the institution still comes out ahead
Yes.
despite everyone's good work, um, and best intentions and allyship and
Mm-hmm.
all of the things. And so it is hard not to be pessimistic, but like you said, you still remain part of the effort. You still do the good work. You still create the space, etc., and lend your voice as in as necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And it's interesting, because I think the key word there is institution, right?
mhm.
Which essentially is system. It's an organized system of how a group of people, a body of people, do their work or accomplish a mission or a goal. And I think that oftentimes the older the institution, the harder it is to reverse course. The larger the institution, it's harder to reverse course. Um, you know, unless you have that truly transformational body of leaders at the top,
Mm-hmm.
you know, who are willing to kind of push
Yeah.
and push hard,
Yeah.
you know, down through the ranks.
Yeah.
Because the body, you know, those, you know, you talk about, you know, the profession, and you know, I found that, you know, in this profession, I've been able to kind of really be myself, have conversations with people of all walks of life, you know, orientations, political thought processes, whatever, and still kind of be my authentic self in the process, and make some really good friends as well that I have to this day, because I can be, the space is here to be my authentic self. But it always goes back to those institutional pressures that are, I think, are inescapable, that we can try to do our best to try to change internally, but without that leader, you know, backing you up, you know, if you will,
Yeah.
you know, willing to really enforce and give what you do some degree of teeth, you know,
Yeah.
in the long run, you know, it's going to backslide, and, you know, we'll be having these conversations again 20 years down the line.
Yeah.
So,
So can we talk about HBCUs a little bit? So I've never worked for an HBCU. I've never done fundraising or prospect development or you know, I've never worked for a HBCU. So I have this Pollyanna, you know, vision that it's all these beautiful Black people with wealth, all these beautiful Black alumni pouring into their alma mater, and the prospect pools are full of brown faces, you know. I'm really, really curious, like, is that true? How does it work? Is that, are and like, as if you could speak for all of them, but like, do HBCUs get to avoid the challenge of diversifying their donor pools? I'm thinking that didn't sound good coming out. I don't know how I feel about that, but
I know, actually, I know what you're saying, and that's interesting. I know what you're saying. And actually, I think that's a good question, because I think on a certain level, it's based off of a perception that many people had, that I even had kind of coming into when I worked for my first HBCU, is that our databases look like majority institution databases, because the thought process that and I do say we, because I'm an HBCU alumna, worked for one, you know, consulting with another or working with another. And I think, you know, looking at the traditional mission of the majority HBCUs, the assumption is that that's still the traditional mission. But HBCUs, you know, I think on a certain level have almost always been diversified. You know, after those initial first classes, 40s, 50s, you know, after desegregation, especially, you know, people don't really understand how affordable HBCUs are compared to some majority white institutions right around the corner. You know, you can get a very quality education for a lower price. Oftentimes, many HBCUs offer programs that the majority white institution does not have. And so that automatically is creating a pipeline of people who are not Black, if you will, you know, coming through the doors. And so I think that's one of the first things I think that, now don't get me wrong, of course, you know, they are going to be majority Black, because that just makes up the majority of the alumni population. But, you know, from the individual side, you do have, you know, they are quite diverse institutions. They really are. Hispanics, Native Americans, white Americans, you name it, you know, they've come through the doors. You know, when I was a Spelman, Morehouse had a very strong contingent of international students from Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. Stayed all 4 or 5 years, consider themselves to be proud HBCU alumni. Same thing can be said with, you know, the other institutions as well. You know, we had at Spelman, if I remember correctly, we had a strong partnership with Eastern Europe. I forgot the institutions and the governments and even like the nations, but, you know, we've, you know, yeah, it's not uncommon. So I think, so you have that aspect, and then you also have the aspect of corporate and foundations, which, you know, when you look at private HBCUs and the gifts that they received, many times it was the endowments, seed money were oftentimes, you know, given by white donors. You can even say the same thing now. You know, corporations, foundations, for the most part, are white created, white owned, generally speaking. And that money oftentimes goes flooding in, especially in the 80s and 90s, to Black institutions. Why? Because they were producing what white institutions were not. And that was educated people with the skill set that these companies needed. Open the door wide open. So I think that, you know, that is a bit more complicated than it would be for majority white. It's a bit more nuanced, if you will, than it is a nuanced perspective or nuanced question than it would be necessarily if we're looking at asking that same thing if we're looking at a white institution, if that makes sense. You know, yes. I don't know if that came out right, but it is different. I think it is different. It's a different question. And I found oftentimes that the diversification historically, I think, is changing, was weaning those Black institutions off of that corporate and foundation money and actually into embracing individual major gifts, going after those people who can give you 5, 6, and 7 figure gifts, because they're there. They're there. You know, and so for me, that I would say that's kind of been the diversification piece, you know, not necessarily in terms of the color or ethnicity of your donors, but more so in terms of institutional versus individual. That makes me sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's another one of my soapboxes, just getting people to understand that corporate and foundation giving is not corporate foundation giving, not family foundation giving, but corporate foundation giving represents 5% of all philanthropy in the United States. So for all the big millions and millions and millions that we imagine the companies are doing for nonprofits and for the good of the world, individuals are doing so much more. They're doing a lot, not to take that away from them, but it's only 5% of the giving pie. And so getting organizations, especially small organizations that are not the big higher edge, you know, or you know, small Black-led organizations, BIPOC-led organizations, helping them understand that, no, you have greater luck building your individual giving program. It's, and yes, you got, yes, that $500,000 grant feels good. It looks good. That $100,000, that $50,000 grant, etc. If you get $1 million, you know, grant, something like that, $1 million comes in from the city or the county. That's great. That's to be congratulated. You continue your mission, etc. But again, think about that being 5%.
Mm-hmm.
5% of your whole potential.
Mm-hmm.
And then like, come on now, let's look at that other 95% and invest some effort there.
Right. Right. And but once again, it goes back to, I think, that mindset. We've
Mhm.
always done it this way. We've got to keep we got to keep the bus moving. And oftentimes with minority-led institutions, it seems like that need is more exacerbated than, let's say, for other organizations. Not saying that it doesn't feel,
Right.
as dire, or for those other organizations, but it's because of the disparities, I think, inherent. And
Mhm.
I'm sure someone listening to this may disagree with that, but I think going back to HBCUs, in my opinion, they've been, especially the state funded schools, have been traditionally underfunded, when it comes to getting their piece of that state budgetary pie. And in fact, it's been pretty well documented that they've been purposely given
Right.
um, uh, a small piece of that budgetary pie. And those things do have an impact. It definitely has an impact, especially, if your individual donor pool, has been, once they've left the institution's, doors, gotten their degree, gotten their jobs, and have moved on, are also subject to systematic pressures of being underpaid, dollar for dollar for the same work that you do. Even more so than if you're a woman or a woman of color, than compared to, let's say, your white male, even, white female counterparts.
Yeah.
Yeah. So all of that does have an effect. And
Yeah.
yeah, so yeah, so it's to me that the answer to that is a bit complicated. It's much more nuanced than I think, a lot of people want to really than a lot of people understand, because it's really not an apples to apples comparison from the very, from the starting line, from the get-go. It's just not.
Mhm. Mhm. I appreciate those insights. Again, I know that I had a very Pollyanna view of just this Black utopia, gorgeous Black people, like off the covers of Ebony and Jet, just, again, supporting their alma mater at these wonderful homecoming events and, all the things. So kind of going back to Cosby, like, Claire and
Girl,
Bill, visiting. Where did they go to college? Hilton? What
Hill,
was it?
was it Hillman, Stillman, girl?
Hillman, Hillman,
Hillman.
Hillman, Hillman, Hillman. So, the idea of like, lots of Hillmanites that just wealthy, well-to-do, affluent, and all those things. But no, I really appreciate that perspective and those insights about the realities of the student body, as well as calling out the ways that what diversification looks like. It's
Mm-hmm.
not always about diversifying the ethnicity of your individual donors, but also definitely diversifying your funders,
Mm-hmm.
your funding sources.
Mm-hmm.
It's absolutely critical. So I think we've talked about some of the challenges as it relates to being a woman, being a Black woman, being in fundraising, etc. But I also want to celebrate our work a bit, and so I'm really curious. Like, what are you most passionate about this work? Prospect dev, as it were, prospect research. What are you most passionate about um, and proud of from the work we do?
I think the fruition, we do so many different things. It's our roles have expanded, beyond just the discovery and the profiling. But the fruition of all the different work that we do, all the different roles that we play in an organization, whether we've worked for large organizations where you're a member of a team of, research development professionals, or you are the sole person in the small shop, or, you have to wear multiple hats, including prospect researcher. It is the fruition of all the different things that you do, seeing, that data set bear potential prospects, seeing the implementation of that new CRM work.
Yes.
Seeing that major gift officer that you've worked intimately with, close that big first ask gift.
Mm-hmm.
And then, or a bigger gift, it's the fruition of the work. That is it for me. I love seeing the end result. And even if I'm not around in the organization to see the end result, at least see the processes, or, how I helped, get it to a point where, even if I'm no longer in that role, they're still succeeding.
Mm-hmm. I love that fruition, and I share that. So I take a lot of pride in knowing, like I drive around the city or drive at, the OSU campus, and there are certain gardens that are there. Like, I did the research and I found that name, and I found some donors for that, I mean, the list goes on, like medical research, gardens, children's program, literacy program. Like, babies got books because of some work that I did.
Exactly.
I love that the point of fruition. So I'm grateful that you called that out. And so I'm also, with that in mind, also really interested in, like, how do we bring more people, more Black people, more people of color? I'm centering Black people in this conversation. How do we bring more Black people, especially more Black women, to prospect development?
Exposure. I think that what you're doing, these conversations that we're having publicly, because oftentimes what we do is behind the scenes. I think on a certain level, people either don't know that we exist or prefer to forget that we exist. Because let's be honest, what we do can be uncomfortable for some. But I really think exposure, is in. It holds true, I think, for any profession where we are not, where we are underrepresented in, where we're not as visible as we should or could be. Because we know we're here, we know the work that we do, we know each other, but we have to, I guess, seize our day. And what you're doing, by these conversations is definitely a part of that. It's definitely a part of that. If the venues that are available to us prove to be uninterested in what we have to say, or, the platforms are inaccessible, we create our own and do what we always done. So, which is do our jobs, and we talk to each other, and then we put it out there for the world to see. So,
yeah. Absolutely. The exposure is important. And I'm kind of thinking about that in opposition to the fact that we are behind the scenes employees. The work that we do is so behind the scenes within the institutions. certainly we have those individual relationships with the gift officers, and those gift officers value us. They value their research partner, their prospect development partner, but the institution often does not, at least not in the same way that it values the frontline fundraiser. So
Right.
I'm curious about how we get others to know about this profession so that they can enter it and work at some of these institutions and continue to be agents of change. But I
Right.
also want to talk just a little bit about doing this work for yourself. As a look at that smile. I think that says it all. That giggle says it all. So yeah, and not just as here's a job, here's a career opportunity, not just like career awareness. Like, no, here's an opportunity for you to take control of your income potential and have impact. So it's not just about raising money. It's not just about earning money and getting the bag, especially if you're in the fundraising position, if you're in the nonprofit sector. So I'm really, really interested in helping other people, especially Black women, because that's who I am. Like, I embrace my brothers, and there's room for them as well.
Really,
I can yes. At the same time, I'm in this conversation, I'm narrowly focused on my experience and the shared experience I know that I'm having with other Black women. So I think there is an opportunity within this field, within this profession, to really like write your own ticket. And we don't know that because we don't know, one, that this is even a profession.
Exists.
Yeah. So I'll pause and let you chime in, because I know that is new space for you. And so if you want to share a little bit about your leap of faith, and I'll just stop talking.
God, because you're right, it is a leap of faith, and it is scary. And I think it's scary because of, all the things that we've already talked about and we've touched upon about, being who we are in the skin that we're in, in the profession that we're in. And, all the unique things, our perspective brings, in addition to the battles that we have to fight that may not necessarily being acknowledged, once again, because of the space that we're in. And nonprofits inherently, for the most part, now whether they actually do it or not, there's a whole nother conversation. But the purpose of a nonprofit is, I think, in a nutshell, is to do some kind of good. And, however a given person wants to define good, it's like another conversation. Whether or not they actually do good, another conversation. But if we presume that that is the inherent mindset of people getting into the profession, then on a certain level, people feel like they can do no wrong. They can do no harm because they're doing good. They're devoted to this cause of educating young Black boys and girls, providing books, to poor Appalachian school children, to improving healthcare outcomes in Native American reservations. Whatever the cause may be, the nonprofit is there to see it's done, is to do good, to make the world a better place. And, many times people do not understand the biases, issues that they bring, to those organizations that then become institutionalized about how they not only deal with the stakeholders, but deal with each other.
Yep.
And it kind of gets tiring, fighting those internal battles. And so, yeah, the opportunity presented itself. And with your encouragement, yeah, it is indeed a leap of faith. It is scary, but it's very rewarding, you know, for me mentally, physically, time I'm able to spend with my family that I feel, because I work so hard for so many different institutions, you know, fighting the good fight. You know, I feel like I've missed out a lot on my children, you know, the development and growth, you know, things that I wished I was more present for when it came to my children. And, you know, as I mentioned, I think, you know, in one of our earlier conversations, you know, I am who I am. Being a mother, being a Black woman is inescapable. I can't separate it. And so this is affording me the opportunity to do that, you know, to be able to take on many projects, to say no if I want to.
Yes,
It's
that that part, because we don't get to say no at work, you know, or I don't know about you. There's been plenty of times when I said, no, I don't want that project. No, I don't have the capacity to take that on. And then it becomes your assignment anyway.
Yeah.
So
No, yeah, no, and or even so much where you say, let's see what we can do to make this tenable, where you can get what you want and I can get what I want. I'm always for what I call the win-win, you know, where you can win and I can win. It's just a little bit of negotiation, a little bit getting on the same page, so that I'm not killing myself and, you know, working myself to death. And, you know, if you happen to be that one supervisor doesn't, you know, like my ass, that you are using this as a means to get me out the door or whatever. You know, because I always feel like that, especially if this is something integral to the survival of the organization or the forward movement of the organization, it's something that needs to be done. It can get done, but it needs to be done in a smart manner. And, you know, that's my other philosophy, you know, win-win, but also working smarter. But yeah, it is a leap of faith, and it's scary, because I think one of the things that our profession does not necessarily have, specifically when it comes to prospect research, is a long and established history of the individual consultant. You know, we've either worked for institutions or we've worked as a part of a consultant agency. You know, let's say Vince Whaley Fleshner kind of thing. But you're still working for someone else rather than working with a client in that capacity. And on a certain level, you still can't say no. So I think, you know, for me, it's navigating that space and learning the skill set that any other consultant, you know, would need. Like, for instance, marketing. How do I get my name out there? You know, how do people know that I'm available, you know, to do the work?
Are you available?
Yes, I am.
Hope's available. Hope's available.
I'm always available. Yes, I am.
Yes. Awesome.
But
yes.
No, but seriously, it's scary, and but there's no way I think that I'm willing, you know, to go back. It's, you know, it's liberating. It really is liberating, and I'm all about liberation, self-determination.
Yes.
And helping others. And if this series, you know, can really expose other Black women, whether they're in something else outside of fundraising, that this is something tenable, it's something that's enjoyable. It is something that is very fulfilling and rewarding. That it's not just one thing.
Yeah.
Go for it. Go for it. And, there are mentors out here. We are out here. And I think the other lovely thing that I've said about our profession is, for the most part, we're very generous and very willing to help. I've never seen a community that is so open, first of all, to asking questions and for asking for help, but then also offering it up, stepping in the role of being mentors to the next generation of researchers, if you will. It's awesome. It's totally awesome. And so, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm so grateful and so thankful for your participation in this series, Research Pride, Hidden Figures in Fundraising. You are absolutely a hidden figure in fundraising. I'm so glad to, grateful for the opportunity to shine light and bring you to the forefront of philanthropy with a capital P. And I think you're being modest about your $4 billion identified, but I'll let that ride. Now I'm like, I'm going to go back when we get off this call. I'm going to look up the places you work, check out the campaigns that they've had during those years. But
no, but seriously, and it kind of goes back to, I think, our role. It never would have, it's always about, well, how much money, how many gifts, how much research have you done for gifts that are actually brought in? And I'm kind of like, that's really not, I want to say a fair question for us. But the way you framed it, that is. That is. Because oftentimes what we identify, never makes it to the finish line. Yeah. Never crosses that finish line. So, yeah.
And then aside from that, there's the strategy, there's the thought partnership, there's the, let me show you how the database works. Let me show you how to find your donors, just all those things that are so important to the cultivation, the stewardship, and the solicitation of our donors. And now being a consultant, being a CEO of my own firm, whereas I'm in a position to say, this is the value, you take it or leave it. Whereas I think before, working for institutions, you're always trying to convince people, these are good donors, these are good names, trust me, these are good names. Or you're navigating that space of, no, I have value, I'm behind the scenes, but I have value. I'm just as relevant as the DOD, the AVP, the Chief Advancement Officer, etc. Now I have the liberty, and liberation is exactly what it is. I have the liberty to say prospect development is important. And if an organization says, no, it's not, okay, it was nice meeting you.
Exactly.
Keep doing it. Keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
You don't need, right, you can do you. And we'll see where you are in 5 years. And that's not harshness, that's just it's liberation.
Reality.
Yeah, and it's a reality. Because we recognize, I've been in this game for a long time now, and I absolutely recognize the organizations that reach their $100 million goals, their $50 million goals, their $3 million goals, are the organizations that invest in robust prospect development with individual giving. So, yeah. So, and you just, you do your best to demonstrate your value, to convince people of your value, to convince people to invest in the value of prospect development, whether or not it's me. Because guess what? There are 1.5 million nonprofit organizations in the country, all of them can't be my client. I don't want all of them to be my client. I need like 2 or 3 a year. So like, it's not like you really, it's like, don't you don't have to choose me. And this series is part of the goal of this series is to show you there are lots of others that you can choose from. But you don't have to choose me, but you have to invest in prospect development. You have to invest in your systems, your fundraising systems, your data management, your institutional knowledge. You have to.
Yes, because otherwise you are ignoring the foundation. You're ignoring the core of what's going to make you successful. It is. It is, girl. Yeah, you've heard me preach on that before. You've heard me preach. That's probably another reason why I'm freelancing, because, like I said, being a fighter, being really passionate about the things that will work.
Yeah.
It can make people uncomfortable. It can make people uncomfortable. And personally, I'd rather spend my time with people who are people in groups and institutions, who are ready to make that change and possibly to hear something a little bit different.
Yeah. That's a nice way of saying it. Now I'm much more straight to the point. You want to get money or not? You want cake? You want cake? Because I want cake. Like, this is quote a movie line from a movie.
It's just like it ain't even about the cake. I'm like, look, y'all got to keep the lights on.
Yeah, that. And then I get, for some organizations, I get really into it. They're like, I need your mission to be here. I need for your mission to stick around. I'm not necessarily one of your constituents, but especially when you think about organizations serving women and girls, especially women and girls of color. Like, no, I absolutely need you to be around. We need you to be around. And the way that you can be around for 100 years, 200 years, however long you want to have your impact, is through individual giving.
Exactly.
So that's where my passion comes from. Yeah.
And me, it's systems. It's like, how are you doing what you're doing? Is it working? What might you be lacking? What do you have an overabundance of? Is it good for you? Is it not good for you? Same thing. It's really that thing. Whereas if it hasn't been working for you in the past, perhaps it's now to hear something a little bit different.
Yeah.
Or maybe I'm going to say the same thing that a previous consultant that you brought in, or a previous worker or employee that you've had, or somebody even on staff has said to you before, and you just needed to hear it again from a different mouth. Someone who does not have the same baggage, as that person who works for you may have, or the presumptions you have, about this particular role. That's, the dog in the fight, if you will, is a little bit different. And that's the really fun thing about this new thing that I'm doing as an independent, researcher, freelancer, consultant. It's fun.
Yes, it absolutely is. It absolutely is. And it has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for spending so much of your day with me today. I really appreciate it. And I know that we can go on and on. I can't say it enough. I'm grateful for your friendship over the years, grateful to have you as a colleague, grateful to know that like you're just out there in the fundraising universe. And I know like there have been times it was like, we're far, I'm in Ohio, you're in Florida, and we haven't seen each other for years. It was like, I know Hope is out there. Like you said, we kind of know, there are Black professionals in this industry, we know each other. And I've appreciated that network within the niche field of
Mhm.
prospect development over the years. And so I appreciate you being a friend and colleague. Thank you for sharing your insights, and thank you for being a hidden figure in fundraising.
You're most welcome. You know, the feeling is definitely mutual. Uh, you in particular have been integral to my sanity, retaining it in this field. Because it's not easy, you know, whether, you know, it's not easy. But I really value you. I value you and so appreciative of you. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you. I appreciate that.